Everything you thought you knew about the Megalodon is wrong. For years, we were told this creature was essentially an oversized great white shark, blindly patrolling the oceans in a perpetual state of hunger and aggression. But the latest scientific that image, we were mistaken, has not shattered it entirely. We were What scientists are now revealing points to a creature far more complex, far larger, and in its sheer existence far more terrifying than even our darkest imaginings could have conceived. It was not simply a big shark. Picture an era spanning nearly 19 million years, dominated entirely by a single ruler. To put that into perspective, we, modern humans, Homo sapiens, represent little more than a blink in the deep history of this planet. Yet across that almost incomprehensible stretch of time, the Megalodon reigned as the unchallenged king of the oceans, the largest shark that ever lived. Even the infamous Tyrannosaurus rex appears startlingly small when placed beside this Livyatan of the deep. While the ticks spread fear across the land, a force was at work beneath the waves whose jaws could have crushed a full-grown whale in a single bite. Not a bite in any romantic sense, but more like a hydraulic press, built from muscle, bone and teeth, extinguishing life in a fraction of a second. Today we begin a journey into the deepest past of our planet, to uncover the true face of the ultimate predator. And then one day, it simply vanished. Like a ghost dissolving in mist, it left behind no bones, no skeleton that could be assembled and displayed in a museum. It left behind teeth large as an open hand, and questions vast enough to fill an entire ocean. Is it possible that it still lurks somewhere in the unexplored, out there somewhere, in the unexplored darkness of the abyss? The thought is as seductive as it is frightening, yet even more unsettling than the idea of a surviving Megalodon is the possibility that we never truly understood it at all. New evidence suggests we were fundamentally wrong. Was the Megalodon not only faster but honey of its power? To understand the truth, we must wind back the clock to the height of its power. We will uncover how and why scientists misread the evidence for so long. The size of a great white shark, once patrolled shark, is irresistible. A mouth wide enough for two full-grown adults to stand inside, side by side. To find out, we need to take a small journey through time, back to the year 1666, to a fateful day on the Italian coast near Livorno. It was a day that would change science forever. Two fishermen pulled an enormous shark from the water. The catch was so shocking that the reigning Duke of Tuscany ordered the curiosity examined immediately. The task fell to Nils Stensno, a Danish anatomist working in Florence, an observer who saw what others missed. And interestingly, it was not the sheer size of the shark that captured Steno's attention most. It was the teeth. As he examined that massive jaw, something remarkable struck him. These teeth resembled what were known as tongue stones. Since antiquity, and particularly during the Middle Ages, people had found triangular, pointed stones embedded in cliff faces and scattered across fields. In folklore and superstition, they were believed to be petrified serpent tongues, or dragon tongues, remnants of mythical beasts or wonders fallen from the sky. But Steno dared to make the revolutionary leap. These stones were neither heavenly nor fantastical. He recognized them for what they truly were. The remains of ancient sharks, sealed within rock across eons of time. He argued that rock strata formed slowly over immense periods, and that an object like a tooth could offer a snapshot of Earth's deep history. The significance of this observation can scarcely be overstated. Fossils are genuine witnesses to an Earth whose history stretches far beyond any human record. But what does this have to do with the Megalodon? Sharks have no bones in shark biology itself. Their skeletons are made of cartilage. Their skeletons are made of cartilage, the same material as our ears and the tips of our noses quickly, which is why shark skeletons almost never survive. Their teeth, however, are extraordinarily resilient. They are often the only part that endures across millions of years, and therefore our best are sometimes only clues to what these animals were, and the Megalodon had many teeth. To be precise, 276 of them, arranged in multiple rows, some reaching up to 18 centimeters in length. That is larger than the palm of most human hands. Like modern sharks, its teeth were continuously replaced. When a tooth from the front row fell out, a new one immediately pushed forward to take its place. An endless conveyor belt of destruction. A single megalodon could consume up to 40,000 teeth across its lifetime. Over the 19 million years the species existed, the ocean floor was quite literally paved with shed teeth. Billions sank downward, were covered by sediment, and began their long transformation into fossils. Each one had the potential to become a window into the past, and it is precisely these fossilized teeth that form the foundation of almost everything we know about this giant shark. We even named it after them. Megalodon comes from the Greek and means simply large tooth, a name that commands respect and also quietly reveals how much we did not know, because for a long time the tooth was all we had to determine what the Megalodon actually was in biological terms. Paleontologists attempted to identify its closest living relatives by studying these teeth. And here begins the great into recent times that persisted well into recent times. When the Megalodon was formally described in 1835, the Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz, he named it Carcharodon megalodon and placed it in close relation to the great white shark. Why? Almost entirely because the large triangulodon resembled those of the modern great white. It seemed logical, iconic triangular blades, both apex predators, both with those iconic triangular blades. And so the assumption took hold: the Megalodon was the great terrible grandfather of the great white shark. This belief best safed our understanding, tending for nearly perfect fit. It seemed like a perfect fit, except that it was not. In the early 2000s, scientists began to look more carefully, truly carefully, and they found clear differences between the teeth of the Megalodon and those of the great white. Researchers conducted morphometric analyses rather than simply trusting visual similarity. The results were in the range of tooth striking. No overlap in the range of tooth shapes. No overlap in the roots. The serration of the great white is irregular and coarse. That of the Megalodon is finer and more uniform. Even the roots, the portion anchored within the jaw, are structurally different. Suddenly it seemed from the Megalodon that the great shark descended from the Megalodon, as had been told for decades. The Megalodon was not a giant great white shark. It was something entirely its own. But if it was not closely related to what we assumed, then to what was it related? And if we could no longer derive its appearance from the great white, what did it actually look like? These questions sent science down a new path, one whose full and unsettling picture has only recently come into focus. We are at the beginning of a discovery that overturns our understanding of prehistoric oceans entirely. The Megalodon was not the lumbering giant we imagined. It was a highly specialized killing machine whose true proportions we are only just beginning to comprehend. And if you thought an 18-meter shark was large, wait until you hear what the new calculations reveal about its actual size. The dimensions we will explore are beyond any scale we previously used. Finding teeth is one thing. Reconstructing the true ruler of the oceans from them is another matter entirely. Scientist Kenshu Shimada used new evidence from tooth analyses to formally reclassify the Megalodon. It was removed from the family of great white sharks and assigned to the extinct family Otodontidae, also known as the megatooth sharks. This may sound at first like bureaucratic hair-splitting in the dusty archives of paleontology, but it carries dramatic consequences for our understanding of the animal. Its relatives were no longer the swift hunters we know from wildlife documentaries, but ancient giants like prowled the seas during the Eocene, an ancestor that already prowled the seas during roughly 60 to 40 million years ago. Came a new scientific name. The Megalodon is now most commonly referred to as Otodus Megalodon. There are ongoing debates within the scientific community, and some researchers prefer other genus designations, but one thing is certain: the connection to the great white shark has been severed. We are dealing with an entirely independent evolutionary lineage, one that was specialized toward growing enormous. That was long the greatest mystery. That was long the greatest mystery. Since we have never found a complete skeleton, all our estimates rested on mathematics and extrapolation. We took the teeth, multiplied their size against the proportions of a great white shark, and arrived at a maximum length of 15 to 18 meters. But the new findings make meet a shark is terrifying. But the new findings make those estimates seem almost modest. A team of 28 international scientists led by paleobiologist Dr. Kenshu Shimada reassessed everything we believed about the megalodon's size. At the centre of this reassessment is a discovery made not far from our own corner of the world, in the Royal Belgian, more valuable to resource sciences than gold, an exceptionally rare collection of fossilized vertebrae. Exceptionally rare and complete. The spine is incomplete, but it is the best we have. The portion of the spine, excluding both the head and the tail, measures an extraordinary length. Imagine that for a moment. Just the back of this animal is as long as a full-sized coach bus, but a trunk alone does not make a shark. The head and tail are missing. To fill those gaps, Shimada's team had to be creative. They compared the Belgian specimen against the Bardi shark proportions, both livings and extinct. It was a colossal puzzle. Working through those vast data sets, they were able to extrapolate what the missing sections must have looked like. The Megalodon's head likely accounted for around 16.6% of its total length. Its tail, the engine driving it forward, claimed a further 32.6%. Applying these percentages to the Belgian vertebral specimen yields an animal with a total length of approximately 16.4 meters. A head some 1.8 meters long, large enough to swallow a person whole without even needing to chew, and a tail stretching 3.6 meters. Up to this point, things seem to fall within the range of older estimates, 16 meters, close to what we already believed. But then science pulls the ground from beneath our feet, because the Belgian shark was not fully grown, or at least it was not the maximum the species could achieve. And here a second discovery enters the story, this time from Denmark. In northern Europe, evidence of something almost beyond comprehension had been waiting. A single isolated vertebra, but this vertebra commands attention. At 23 centimeters wide, it dwarfs anything previously seen. When the same mathematical formulas developed by Shimada's team are applied to this Danish vertebra, the result shatters every scale we had previously worked with. This single bone suggests that some individuals of Otodus Megalodon did not stop growing at 16 or 18 meters. The new calculations catapult the maximum size of the Megalodon to an astonishing, settle for a moment, 24.3 meters. Let 24.3 meters. That is nearly 10 meters longer than our previous upper estimates. To place that in everyday perspective, a standard city bus is roughly 12 meters long. The Megalodon was as long as two of those buses placed end to end. Or consider a standard outdoor swimming pool, often 25 meters in length. If a megalodon of this size were to enter that pool, its snout would touch one wall, while its tail fin barely cleared the other. There would be no room left for water, let alone for swimmers. At this size, it rivals the blue whale, the largest animal ever known to have lived on Earth. But while the blue whale is a peaceful filter drawing in plankton, Megalodon was an act-killing machine, and with that length came mass. A body of these dimensions is not made of air. Weight estimates for such a specimen are absolutely staggering. We are speaking of up to 94 metric tons. That is equivalent to roughly 60 mid-size cars stacked upon one another, heavier than a main battle tank at full combat weight. Imagine a living creature heavier than a tank, moving through water with lethal elegance and speed. These new dimension shark is a predator, a 15-meter shark im Schicksaflussatcher. A 24-meter shark is a force. It is no longer simply a fish in the conventional sense. It is a biological submarine. This enormous scale immediately raises new questions. How could a predator grow so large? How did it feed? A body measured quantities of energy simply to exist, let alone to hunt. Nature does not build mistakes of this magnitude. If the Megalodon reached 24 meters, it cannot have looked like a great white shark. It must have been differently built in order to carry and move that weight. 94 tons of living mass distributed across 24 meters of length demands a very specific height to be corrected. And this is precisely where the next great misunderstanding must be corrected. Looking at the data from the new study that the proportions simply did not add up under the old model. The Megalodon was not a swimming tank. To achieve that length, it must have had a different form, one we had entirely overlooked, but size alone is only the exterior. To transform nearly 100 tons of mass into a precise weapon, a force is required that has no equal in nature. We have spoken of length and weight, but the true secret lies in how that mass was applied. What use is the sharpest tooth if the jaw behind it lacks the force to drive it through solid bone? The answer leads us away from biology and into the realm of pure destructive physics. Behind those 18-centimeter teeth weighted which modern steel would bend like paper, we now have a picture of this animal. We know it could reach lengths of over 200 tons, an impressive biomass, a colossal mountain of ills, an impressive through flesh, cartilage, and muscle pushing through the ocean. But mass alone does not make a hunter. A blue whale is also massive, perhaps even heavier, yet it is peaceful, filtering tiny crustaceans from the water. The Megalodon was an architect of destruction. To sustain that immense body, it had to kill, and kill often. And to bring down prey that was itself the size of a bus, being large was not enough. A weapon was needed. A weapon so constructed that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. That weapon was its jaw, and the force contained within it can be expressed in a number so vast and abstract that we must first translate it into something tangible: 180,000 newtons. When scientists cite this figure, they often nod in knowing appreciation, but to most of us it sounds like little more than a large number. What does a bite force of 180 press used in industrial scrapyards, those massive machines into tidy cubes of metal, that compressed old cars into tidy cubes of metal? The pressure a Megalodon could exert in a single bite is equivalent to roughly 18 metric tons bearing down on a focused point. It is the strongest bite force for any living creature on this planet. To put it in context, a human biting down hard generates perhaps 800 to 1,000 newtons. A lion, the apex predator of the African newtons, reaches around for us certainly lethal, but terrifying for us. To the Megalodon, it is little more than a gentle pinch. Even the Tyrannosaurus rex, the undisputed ruler of the land, fades against this maritime superpower. The T-Rex to 57,000 newtons, enough to pulverize bone. But the Megalodon was not merely stronger, it was 3 to 5 times stronger than the T-Rex. If the T-Rex was a pistol, the Megalodon was a howitzer. There was no armour, no shield, no skeletal structure in the ocean capable of withstanding that pressure. But force means nothing without the right tool to deliver it. A hammer blow is useless when struck with a pillow. The Megalodon had no pillows. It had teeth. And what teeth they were, even that is almost an understatement. And even that, an understatement, within that gigantic mouth, which could open wide enough to engulf 2 standing adults side by side, were 276 teeth arranged in 5 perfect rows, like soldiers in formation. Each tooth could grow to 18 centimeters in length. Imagine a long kitchen knife. That is the scale we are speaking of. But these teeth were not shaped like knives. Knives are thin and snap under hard resistance. The Megalodon's teeth were thick, robust, and triangular, built not to break. Running along their edges was a fine serration, functioning like an oversized butcher's blade. When the jaws snapped shut, the full 180,000 newtons did their work, but it was the lateral shaking of the head that drove those teeth soaring through flesh and bone. It was a combination of a hydraulic press and a chainsaw. This anatomy also tells us a great deal about its prey. An animal does not develop such a weapon to catch small fish. That would be energetic madness. The Megalodon a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. The Megalodon hunted prey that fought back. Prey that was massive, was so powerful that they could crush a small whale in a single bite. We are not speaking of flesh wounds. We are not speaking of the total destruction of the rib cage. When a Megalodon attacked a prehistoric whale, it often aimed for the chest. The force of 180,000 caused the whale's ribs to explode like dry kindling. The lungs and heart were instantly punctured or crushed. It was an attack designed to end the fight immediately. The first strike was almost always struggle. The first strike was almost always fatal. This brutality was necessary. Whales are formidable opponents, armoured by thick layers of blubber, powerful muscles, and a robust skeleton. To penetrate those defences and reach the vital organs required an evolutionary solution. The Megalodon was fascinating aspect of this lethal mechanics is redundancy. What happens when a tooth breaks against bone during such a violent impact? For us, a lost tooth is a catastrophe. For the Megalodon, like a revolving occurrence. It's Jodor's revolving magazine. Behind each active tooth in the front row waited multiple replacements in the rows behind. Wait and the next rotated into position. Within 24 to 48 hours, the system was so efficient that the shark always maintained a perfect arsenal. It never had to hunt with dull weapons. Over its lifetime, a single Megalodon may have used up to 40,000 teeth. Imagine the ocean floor beneath its hunting grounds. A battlefield scattered with was always sharp, always lethal, always sharp, always ready, always lethal. But the engineering of nature went further still. The Megalodon's jaw was not rigidly fused to its skull, as our upper jaw is to our heads. It was loosely suspended, allowing the mouth to open extraordinarily wide and the upper jaw to thrust forward during the bite, a maneuver we often observe in modern great white sharks captured in slow motion. That moment when the animal seems almost to change its face, eyes rolling back for protection as the teeth surge forward to seize the prey. In the Megalodon, scaled up to its full gigantic dimensions, that sight must have bade thing many ocean creatures ever witnessed. When we speak of the Megalodon, we tend to call it a monster, but that word does something unnatural. A monster is something a disservice, something chaotic, The Megalodon was the precise opposite. It was the result of millions of years of biological fine-tuning. Every millimetre of its jaw, every newton of its bite force, had a purpose. It is a frightening perfection, a machine of flesh and blood, whose sole function was to weigh flesh in the form of whale flesh as efficiently as possible. Those 180,000 newtons were not simply raw violence, sea to survival, but an engine of run-on air alone. To create such a biological superpower, the oceans themselves had to change. It required a very specific chapter in Earth's history, a golden age of abundance that laid the table for the Megalodon. A hunter, after all, is only as large as what it hunts. And the menu of the ancient world held surprises that made this kind of gigantism possible. Nothing in nature occurs without reason. Evolution is not a chaotic dice thrower conjuring monsters out of idle whimsy. It is a pragmatic, almost ruthless engineer. Every feature, every fin, every tooth serves a function oriented toward a single goal: survival and the passing on of genes. If we ask why the Megalodon grew to a colossus of 24 meters and nearly 100 tons, we must understand what problem nature was actually trying to solve with this gigantic solution. Why was a 5-meter shark no longer sufficient? What drove this predator to take on dimensions that seem physically almost impossible? To answer that, we must look deep into this animal's family tree. For a long time, we believed the Megalodon was the end product of a lineage that also produced the great white shark. But as we have already discovered, that was an error. Scientists have formally reclassified the Megalodon into the extinct family, the megatooth sharks. This is decisive because that family had its own history, a history of growth. It all began much earlier in the Eocene, roughly 60 to 40 million years ago, was a shark called Otodus obliquus. Already impressive, perhaps reaching 10 meters, but not yet a megalodon. Yet even then grew a little larger. With each sharks grew visible. It was a slow but unstoppable escalation. The engine driving this growth was a classic evolutionary arms race, not the empty blue expanses we often imagine today. The Miocene, the epoch during which the Megalodon reached its peak, was a kind of Serengeti of the seas. The water was warmer, nutrient density was high, and life was exploding in every direction. But the most important development for our shark was the rise of the marine mammals, whalefins and other ocean rapidly, began diversifying and multiplying rapidly during this time. And they did something that represented an irresistible temptation for any cold-blooded hunter. They developed thick layers of fat. Blubber. For a predator, whale fat is the ultimate fuel. It is pure, highly concentrated energy. Delivers thousands of times more calories than a mouthful of fish. Here the spiral began. To stay warm in cold water and swim more efficiently, whales grew larger and heavier across the millennia. For a predator, this created a problem. A small shark cannot hunt a large whale. The whale is too strong, too fast, and its fat layer too thick for small teeth to penetrate. The evolutionary buffet had to grow. Only those large enough to kill a whale gained entry to that enormous caloric resource. And those with access to so many calories could in turn afford an even larger body. A further aspect illuminated by recent research concerns the efficiency of movement. We recall the new body image: slimmer, longer, more hydrodynamic. That too is an evolutionary outcome. A massive, stocky body creates enormous resistance in water. Water is a dense medium. Anyone who has tried to run quickly through a swimming pool knows the drag. For a 24-meter giant, that resistance is the greatest physical obstacle. A creature with the proportions of a great white shark would have been as aerodynamically, or rather hydrodynamically, efficient as a brick. It would have wasted immense amounts of energy simply moving from place to place. Evolution corrected this with remarkable precision. It stretched the animal. A longer, slimmer body glides more smoothly through water. We see the same principle in modern blue whales. Their streamlined form allows them to travel thousands of kilometers across the world's oceans without exhausting themselves. Efficiency was not a luxury for the Megalodon. It was a direct adaptation to the necessity of patrolling vast, critical. Because a body of 94 tons carries a tremendous metabolic burden. It is a combustion engine that must never be allowed to run dry. An inefficient swimmer would have needed to eat more on a fine edge. Evolution balanced the Megalodon on a fine edge, large enough to kill whales but streamlined enough not to burn through too much energy in the effort. It is fascinating to see how all these factors interlocked. The availability of whale prey drove it towards size. The physics of water imposed a long, elegant form. It was not a single factor that created the Megalodon. It was the perfect convergence of biological composites. But so long as the Miocene held, so long as the seas were warm and filled with fat, slow-moving whales, this system worked perfectly. The Megalodon was the crown of creation within its niche. It had no enemies, no competition that could challenge it. It was the absolute ruler. Yet to understand this enormous body more fully, we must look deeper into its physiology. A fish of this scale confronts biological limits that would be insurmountable for an ordinary cold-blooded creature. Supplying 94 tons of living tissue with oxygen and warmth demands more than sheer size. It demands an internal engine so powerful that it set the Megalodon apart from nearly every other fish that has ever lived. Cold blood is simply biological in the ocean. Cold blood simply biological reality. A goldfish in a tank, a trout in a stream, an ordinary shark in the open sea. They are all ectotherms, meaning their body temperature matches exactly the temperature of the water around them. When the water is cold, they become sluggish. Their muscles work more slowly, their metabolisms are delayed. They are slaves to their environment. They are slaves to their environment, dependent on sunlight and warm currents to function at all. But if the Megalodon was truly the terror of the oceans, the active hunter that pursued whales across hundreds of kilometers and drove 94 tons of mass through the water, this presents a fundamental physical problem. A creature of such size powered by a cold engine would have been nearly incapacitated in deep, dark or cool waters, not a killing machine, the glacis. This is where one of the most groundbreaking discoveries in modern paleontology comes in, one that has completely transformed our picture of this animal. Research, particularly the work of scientists including Humberto Ferron, suggests that the Megalodon was a biological exception. It was slightly mesothermic, partially warm-blooded. Let us unpack this term, because it is the key to the Megalodon's dominance. Mesothermy, or regional endothermy, does not mean the Megalodon maintained a constant body temperature of 37 degrees as we do, or as mammals do. It was not a constant heat source, but it possessed the remarkable ability to keep certain parts of the brain, the eyes, and the massive swimming muscles significantly warmer than the surrounding water. Think of it like a high-performance sports car. The bodywork may be cold, but the engine block is glowing with heat and energy. That is how the Megalodon functioned. It was a biological furnace ploughing through the ocean. But how does a fish accomplish this? Water conducts heat roughly 25 times faster than air. For an animal in water, retaining warmth is extremely difficult. Evolution equipped the Megalodon and its ancestors, as well as some related animals alive today, such as the great white shark and the tuna, with an ingenious heat exchange system called the Rete Mirabile or Wonder Net. Cold, oxygen-rich blood vessels coming from the gills run directly alongside warm blood vessels coming from the working muscles. The heat generated by those muscles transfers to the cold blood. The warmth is recycled internally rather than radiated outward. This ability was an absolute game-changer in the history of the oceans. It gave the Megalodon powers unavailable to other sharks. First, speed. Warm muscles contract faster and more powerfully than cold ones. While other predators slowed in cooler depths, the Megalodon could call upon its explosive force anywhere. It was as if it had a permanent turbocharger built in. This explains how it was able to hunt the great fast-moving whales, which were themselves warm-blooded mammals. Without this internal heating, the Megalodon would have had no chance against agile whales. It would have been a tractor trying to catch a racing car. With mesothermy, it was the racing car. Second, digestion. This may sound mundane, but for a creature measured in tons, digestion is a matter of life and death. Breaking down vast quantities of flesh, bone, and fat far more quickly, and converting them into usable energy. A cold stomach could have taken weeks to process such a meal. The Megalodon burned through fuel almost thinks faster. Eyes respond sharply. Respond more sharply. In murky depths, or during complex hunting maneuver to defeat the escape route of a fleeing whale, milliseconds matter. The Megalodon was not a blunt feeding instrument. It was a highly alert tactical hunter. This biological marvel also had geographical consequences. For a long time, it was assumed the Megalodon was a creature of warm tropical waters, was unable to survive in the cold, but analyses of its global distribution, the Megalodon was fully capable of inhabiting cooler latitudes. It was not chained to the equator. Thanks to its internal heating, it could venture into cooler seas, perhaps into the waters we now call as long as sufficient prey was available. Its distribution did not necessarily follow patterns of warming or cooling. Yet as with everything in nature, the ultimate all-weather cost. Yet as with everything in nature, this superpower came with a cost. And that cost was enormous. Artificially heating a 94-ton body demands energy. Unfathomable amounts of it. While a crocodile can go weeks or months without food, simply switching into an energy-saving mode, the Megalodon's engine was always running at high idle. It could not switch off. It was condemned to hunt. Its own body became a tyrannical slave driver, constantly demanding more calories. Was not only the strongest hunter that ever lived, it was also the hunger's edge. As long as the oceans were filled with fat, the Megalodon's operating model functioned. Invest great energy in warmth and size, capture enormous prey, or recover that energy many times over. A perfect balance. But when that balance tipped, when the buffet was suddenly closed, was extraordinarily vulnerable to change. A smaller predator can wait out a famine. A warm-blooded giant of this size burns itself when the supply runs dry. It is a cruel irony. The very quality that made it the unchallenged ruler, its warm-bloodedness, made it dependent and vulnerable. It was a biological high-risk investment. This understanding of its internal temperature changes how we see the animal entirely. It was not a sluggish relic of the ancient world. It was a dynamic, almost modern creature. When you see a great white shark today, you see something like a Megalodon in miniature. The great white, too, uses regional endothermy to hunt in cold waters off South Africa or southern Australia. But the Megalodon took this principle to its absolute extreme. The warm-bloodedness also explains why we find its teeth on nearly every coastline on Earth. From the shores of Europe to the Americas, from Australia to Asia, it was a citizen of the world driven by its inner fire. And we are not speaking of a few fish at breakfast. We are speaking of quantities that strains the imagination. This insatiable appetite, which kept it at the apex for millions of years, became a ticking time bomb when the world began to change. It was the beginning meteor strike. Not through a meteor, but through a creeping hunger that even the greatest hunter of all time could no longer satisfy. We have described the biological power harn. We know it was partially warm-blooded. It was partially warm-blooded, a high-performance engine in a cold world, that a powerful engine is useless without fuel. And the more capable the machine, the more enormous its thirst. For the Megalodon, that thirst was an unquenchable eternal hunger that transformed the oceans of the world into a place of absolute terror for nearly 20 million years. To maintain that massive body and elevated temperature, the Megalodon had to consume caloric quantities almost beyond comprehension. Scientists of great white shark, a modern white shark weighing roughly 1 ton, can subsist for weeks on a single rich find. The Megalodon could not afford such luxuries. The Megalodon, a grown Megalodon, required over a metric ton of food every single day, just to avoid starvation. This physiological compulsion made it the most aggressively active hunter the Earth has ever seen. It was not an opportunistic scavenger waiting on lucky chances. It was an active architect of its own food supply, and on that menu were no sardines. For efficiency, the prey had to be proportionate to the predator. The Megalodon specialized in the most energy-dense resource the ocean offered. Whales, the seas of the Miocene, were full of them. Many whale species of that era were smaller than today's giants. Some, like Cetatherium, reached only around 5 to 10 meters. For a human, these are still enormous animals. For a Megalodon, they were the perfect snack, a convenient portion between larger meals. The Megalodon's hunting strategy, reconstructed from fossil bite marks on whale bones, speaks to a brutal efficiency. While the modern great white typically attacks from behind, targeting soft tissue, the Megalodon often struck head-on. It had the weapons for it. Its jaws were so massive that it could quail's skull or rib cage in a single bite. Imagine the scene. A peaceful day in the ocean roughly 10 million years ago. A group of small baleen whales drift slowly through nutrient-rich water, perhaps what is now the Portuguese coast. They feel safe. Then, without warning, a shadow surges from the depths below. Unlike modern sharks, which often patrol near the surface, the Megalodon likely used the dark water as camouflage. Its grey back merged with the darkness below, while its pale underside rendered it invisible against the light filtering down craft, a principle that submarine designers would later apply to their own craft. The attack came from below, vertical as a missile. The impact of up to 94 tons of mass travelling at speed must have been catastrophic. Bones broke before the first bite. The whale's internal organs were ruptured by the shock wave, and then the teeth closed, a jaw wide enough to engulf 2 people standing side by side. The teeth drove through blubber and ribs directly into the lungs or heart. Records show whale pulverized or bearing deep furrows left by teeth. Some whales survived such attacks reveal silent testimony to a failed assassination. But most of the time, there was no escape. Another tactic identified by paleontologists was the deliberate disabling of the prey's propulsion. We often find fossilized flipper bones from whales that were cleanly severed. The Megalodon would simply bite away a whale's tail or pectoral fins. A whale without propulsion is helpless. It cannot flee. It drifts as a living buffet, while the shark feeds at leisure. It is an image of absolute dominance, a surgical ruthlessness dictated by the need for efficiency. The shadow it cast influenced the entire ocean. Scientists speak of a landscape of fear. The mere existence of such a super predator shaped where other animals lived. Entire ecosystems danced to the Megalodon's rhythm. Where it was, silence reigned. Where it was present, silence reigned. One could almost feel sympathy for this creature. Imagine being compelled to eat your entire life, driven by a metabolism that burns you from the inside. If you pause, the Megalodon was a prisoner of its own biology. It could not simply rest for a week. Always searching for the next source of fat. This dependence on high-calorie food, specifically whale blubber, was also its Achilles heel. A predator so specialized is vulnerable. When the food source dries up, the specialist faces catastrophe, while the generalist survives. But one aspect of this eternal hunger is often overlooked. The Megalodon was not the only guest, the most dangerous, but it was not alone. The strongest, but it was not alone. In the same waters swam other giants, enormous predatory whales, ancestors of today's sperm whales also armed with formidable teeth. The oceans were not a zone of peaceful coexistence. They were a battlefield for resources. And when 94 tons of hunger collides with a rival that is also hungry and equally armed, the ocean trembles. We tend to picture the Megalodon as a solitary ruler floating above everything else. But the truth is more compelling. It had to defend its crown every single day. Hunger drove it to take risks. It attacked prey that fought back. A mother whale with lethal resolve. A single blow from a massive tail fin could injure even a megalodon, and an injured megalodon is a dead megalodon. If it cannot slows, it starves. It was a life walked on a tightrope. It was a life on a tightrope. We still find traces of this eternal feeding today. It's broken off during attacks. Them of repeated contact with hard bone. Evidence of repeated contact with hard bone. Each of these finds tells the story of a meal that took place millions of years ago. But what happens when the undisputed champion meets an opponent, but an equal adversary? During the same epoch in which the Megalodon reigned, a whale that did not filter plankton, but bore teeth as large as a forearm. A whale whose name resonates like a thunderclap. Livyatan Melville, we leave behind the one-sided narrative of hunter, and hunted and enter an arena where two superpowers face one another. A confrontation that would shake the oceans to their foundations. Livyatan was an ancient sperm whale, but it shared nothing with the relatively gentle sperm whales of today, with largely toothy dip-after squid, with largely toothless upper jaws. The Livyatan was a killing machine built for frontal assault. It reached an estimated length of 13 to 17.5 meters, shorter than the maximum size now attributed to the Megalodon, but more massively built, that gave even the great shark cause for concern. Ruthian 17 shark cause concern, while the Megalodon bore 206 triangular serrated teeth, up to 18 centimeters long. The Livyatan relied on raw stopping power. Its teeth were massive, thick, and conical, and they were gigantic. We are speaking of teeth up to 6 centimeters in length, more than twice those of the Megalodon, and roughly as long as a human forearm. These are the largest functional teeth ever found on any animal. They were not designed for cutting. They were built to crush bone and hold prey that fought back with the force of a freight train. The Livyatan was, like the Megalodon, a macropredator. It hunted other whales. When these two met, it was almost always over a whale carcass, or the hunting territory, through which smaller baleen whales moved. Picture the scene. A dead whale drifting at the surface of an ancient Pacific, perhaps 10 million years ago. The scent of fat and blood drifts for kilometers through the water. The Megalodon, guided by its phenomenal sense of smell, approaches from below. It is a 94-ton colossus, warm-blooded, fast and aggressive. It claims the carcass. Then a group of Livyatan whales appears. Here, two completely different evolutionary strategies collide. The solitary hunter against the social unit. Cartilage against mammalian intelligence. Instinct against cognition. The Megalodon had the advantage of sheer mass and superior close-range weaponry. Its jaw could open wider. Its bite at 180,000 newtons was stronger. It was strike to the flank of the ocean. A direct strike to the flank of a Livyatan would have ended the contest immediately. Razor-edged teeth carving through flesh and muscles to the spine, but the Livyatan held an advantage that cannot be measured in tons or centimetres. Its brain, as a mammal, it possessed an intelligence far beyond that of any shark. It could learn, develop strategies. Sperm whales have complex social structures. If one Livyatan was attacked, others likely came to its aid. What prevails in the end? Raw, unstoppable force. The Livyatan also held a perceptual superpower. Echolocation. Through its enormous head, filled with spermaceti, it could emit sound waves and construct a precise three-dimensional image of its surroundings, even in complete darkness. It could sense the Megalodon long before the shark could smell it. It could scan the shark's internal structures, estimate its size. Within direct engaging one duel, the outcome would have been utterly unpredictable. The Megalodon, with its newly reconstructed slimmer fins, possessed surprising maneuverability. It would have attempted to ram the whale from below or the side, stunning it before biting. The Livyatan would have tried to use its massive skull as a battering ram or seize the shark with its monstrous teeth and shake it. It would have been a clash of titans, and the water would have run red. Yet in nature, predators avoid unnecessary fights. An injury often means death, even mutual assessment. Most encounters likely ended with a mutual displays and the retreat of the weaker party. But when hunger was sufficient, and we know the Megalodon needed over a ton of food daily, this competition had far-reaching consequences. This confrontation became consequences. The Livyatan occupied the same ecological niche as the Megalodon. It ate the same prey, resources had to be shared. In times of plenty, this was manageable. But as the climate changed and the oceans began to transform, this competition became deadly. Interestingly, both giants disappeared at roughly the same time. The Livyatan went extinct, and the Megalodon followed into oblivion. This suggests they were both of the same transformation. The decline of the smaller baleen whales that formed their primary diet struck both equally hard. There is one more dimension to this drama of rivalry: the rise of the orcas. Today's killer whales are in many ways the smaller, faster and far more intelligent successors to the Livyatan. While the Livyatan went extinct, the ancestors of the orca began to ascend, and it is not improbable that young megalodons, despite their considerable size at birth, occasionally appeared on the menu of organised whale pods. The contest between Megalodon and Livyatan represents the apex of an era. It was the last time in Earth's history that two such mega-predators shared the world. Never again has nature attempted to build predators of such calibre. Neither the great white shark, nor the modern sperm whale, or this offensive, destructive capacity. For the Megalodon, the existence of the Livyatan was a constant warning. It was not invulnerable, it was not alone. This competition drove further adaptations. Size was protection. Size was power. It was an arms race that ultimately reached a dead end. Today we look out at an ocean that seems peaceful by comparison. Great whales, great sharks for absolute seals. The Megalodon may have won the contest for absolute size. 24 metres against 17 is a decisive margin. But in the competition for long-term survival, both lost. They were too large, too specialised, and too dependent on a world that was slowly growing colder and emptier. before that inevitable decline set in, there was a period during which the Megalodon not only kept its rival dominated every corner of the world's oceans. It was not a local phenomenon, not a myth, confined to a single bay. When we map its fossil finds, the true extent of its empire becomes clear. A king who accepted no borders, geographical or biological. We tend to think of great empires, we tend to think of Rome or the Mongols, civilizations that swept across vast continent and drew lines on maps. But long before the first human learned to hold a stone as a tool, there existed an empire far larger, more powerful, and more enduring than anything humanity has ever produced. An empire without borders, without walls, without fixed territories. The global empire of the Megalodon. The Megalodon was not a local phenomenon. It was not some eccentric monster haunting a forgotten bay. It was a true citizen of the world, a cosmopolitan of deep time. Its rule was absolute and all-encompassing. If you were to look at a globe and point to any ocean, whether the Atlantic, the Pacific, or the Indian Ocean, you would most likely be pointing to a place where this giant once patrolled. The evidence for this worldwide dominance is as numerous as grains of sand, almost literally, fossil on every single continent on Earth, with one icy exception: Antarctica. From the sun-scorched deserts of Peru in the Atacama region to the misty coastlines of Denmark, from the beaches of Australia to the riverbeds of South Carolina, and yes, even here in Europe. We tend to think of our familiar northern coastlines as tranquil, temperate places, but 10 to 15 million years ago in the Miocene, warm, shallow seas extended far inland. Parts of what is now northern Belgium and the Netherlands were submerged beneath a warm, shallow the Dutch coast. Famous fossil sites in Antwerp are silent witnesses to this time. Walking the beaches of certain stretches of the North Sea coast today, there is a real black triangular shark teeth in the sand, triangular shark species, usually smaller species, but occasionally a fragment of a king appears. The Megalodon was in a very real sense our neighbour. It swam where we now set out our beach chairs. How was such universal presence even possible? Most sharks are bound to specific temperature zones or habitats. Reefs rarely leave the reef. Polar sharks avoid warm water. But the Megalodon broke these rules. The scientific explanation lies in the combination of its biological superpowers. Its capacity for mesothermy, the fact that it could keep its body warmer than the surrounding water, was its passport sport. It was not anchored to the equator. While classical cold-blooded creatures had to turn back at invisible temperature barriers, it could broke through them. It could follow the whales, and that is the decisive point. Mobility. Whales, its primary food source, are wanderers. They cover thousands of kilometers annually between their feeding and breeding grounds. A sedentary predator would have starved the moment the whales moved on. But the Megalodon was the shadow that followed the herds, no matter how far the road stretched. The new slimmer body form reconstructed by Shimada style, a stocky heavy body, would have been a hindrance for such an existence. The drag would have been too great, the energy cost too high, but resembling that of the modern blue whale, made the Megalodon a perfect long-distance swimmer, built for the marathon as well as the sprint. It could cross oceans the way we travel highways. The Megalodon's global distribution also reflected the geography of the ancient Earth. The map of the Miocene looked different from today. The Isthmus of Panama was still open, enabling a vast warm ocean current to circulate around the equator. This was the superhighway of the Megalodon, allowing it to move between oceans without ever crossing cold water if it chose not to. Nutrients circulated globally and life flourished, had limits, yet even this mighty empire had. Antarctica remained beyond its reach. The water there was, despite its internal heating, simply too extreme. There are physical thresholds beyond which the energy cost of keeping warm exceeds the value of the prey available. Antarctica became one of the few refuges where whales could escape the terror, the only place on the map where the sonar of the deep did not announce the heartbeat of a giant. Perhaps this was the beginning of the polar migration of whales, a flight into the cold to escape the fire of the Megalodon. We humans consider ourselves the masters of the world because of our technology and our tools, but we need those tools to survive. The Megalodon needed only its biology. It conquered the planet with nothing but muscle, teeth, and a perfect design. And yet this very omnipresence raises a persistent modern myth. If the Megalodon was truly everywhere, if it was so adaptable and capable of crossing oceans, could it not have simply retreated to a place we have not yet explored? The ocean immense, and we have mapped only a fraction of it. If it was once everywhere, if it was oncey, why not somewhere still in some hidden and undisturbed corner? One name in particular is always invoked when imagination overtakes science: the Mariana Trench, the deepest scar in the Earth's crust. 11 kilometers down, dark and largely unexplored. Would that not be the perfect hiding place for a fallen king? But before we are seduced by the hope of survival, we must confront an inconvenient truth. The Mariana Trench is not a quiet refuge, it is a physical hell, and to understand why the king cannot reign there, we must follow it to where the light dies and the pressure crushes everything. It is the most tempting theory in popular science, a thought that sends a shiver down the spine, while simultaneously igniting our sense of adventure. If the Megalodon was the king of the oceans, and if we have only explored a fraction of the world's seas, could it not simply be hiding? Is there a place on this planet so remote, so dark, and so inaccessible that even a 24-meter creature could survive there undetected? The idea found its most famous expression in a blockbuster film positing that the Megalodon survived in the Mariana Trench, sheltered by a thermal layer, isolated from the outside world, waiting a magnificent story. It is a magnificent story, a perfect screenplay, but when we shine the light of science into that eternal darkness, the myth crumbles to dust. To understand why this theory persists, we need to return to its origin. It is grounded not only in the imagination of screenwriters, but in a genuine scientific misunderstanding from the 19th century. In 1873, HMS Challenger set out on a legendary expedition now recognised as the birthplace of modern oceanography. During this, researchers dragged trawl nets across the deep ocean floor, including near the Mariana Trench. What they hauled aboard created both confusion and wonder. They found Megalodon teeth, but these teeth looked different from the fossilised specimens found in cliff faces. They were not dark brown or black with age. They were white, almost pearl white. They looked fresh. Scientists of the time dated these teeth to an age of only 11 to 24,000 years. By geological standards, that is yesterday. It would have meant the Megalodon survived the last ice age and was a contemporary of the earliest modern humans. If it was alive 20,000 years ago, why not today? These seemingly fresh teeth became the holy grail of cryptozoology. But modern chemistry has resolved the mystery, and they are sobering. The teeth were not young, they were ancient. The reason for their pale colour and good condition was a thick crust of manganese dioxide that forms around objects on the deep ocean floor. This mineral layer acted like a vacuum seal, preserving the tooth and slowing its decay dramatically. Later were millions of years old. It was a chemical illusion. Illusion, not evidence of survival. But let us take the scenario seriously regardless. Could the Megalodon theoretically survive in the Mariana Trench? We are speaking of a depth of 11 kilometers, It would crush a solid steel container like an empty tin can. Animals that live there have gelatinous bodies with no gas-filled cavities to withstand that force. Megalodon had a skeleton of calcified cartilage. While cartilage is more flexible than bone, the physiological adaptations required to exist at 11 kilometers depth that it would no longer be a megalodon. It would have to look entirely different. Move differently, and function differently. But the greater problem is not the pressure, it is the energy. We recall what we learned about its metabolism. The megalodon was partially warm-blooded and required enormous quantities of energy to keep its giant body and warm brain running. It needed tons of high-calorie fat, specifically whales, every single day. The Mariana Trench is, in biological terms, a desert, one of the most inhospitable environments on the planet. Yes, life exists there. We have sent expeditions down. We know reasonably well what lives at those depths. But the biomass is vanishingly small. The deepest living fish we know survive at around 8,000 meters depth. They are around 20 to 30 centimeters long, composed almost entirely of water and gelatinous tissue, and move in sea slow motion. There are no large schools of seals, no large schools of tuna, because there is nothing to eat. Plants cannot grow without light, so the base of the food chain is depths and depends on what drifts down from above, the so-called Letian snow, the so-called marine snow, dead organic particles. For a warm-blooded and empty refrigerator, it would simply starve. It would need to consume thousands of those tiny, nutrient-poor creatures every day just to cover its basic searching for them, and it would more ever recover by eating them. A death sentence, a negative energy balance. A death sentence. Add to this the cold. Water at those depths sits just above freezing. For a shark that must retain heat, this would be catastrophic. The frigid water would draw body warmth away at terrifying speed. It would have to eat even more to sustain its temperature in an environment where there is nothing to eat. It is a vicious cycle. The often cited point that we have only explored a fraction of the oceans, but in this context, it is misleading. Think of it this way. Claiming the megalodon might be hiding undetected is a bit like claiming an unknown species of elephant is roaming undetected through a familiar forest. Elephants leave traces. They fell trees. They leave droppings. A super predator like the megalodon would leave massive traces on the ecosystem, even if we never saw it directly. We would find whales bearing enormous crescent-shaped bite wounds matching no known animal. Our highly sensitive sonar arrays, with which research institutes continuously monitor the world's oceans, would record acoustic signatures that cannot be explained. We would find carcasses washing ashore. None of this happens. The argument that it might be living cryptically, making itself extremely scarce, also collapses under the weight of metabolic reality. A population must maintain a minimum size to remain genetically viable. You cannot sustain a species across millions of years with 2 or 3 individuals. There would need to be thousands and thousands of giant sharks cannot hide. Our modern oceans are optimized for efficiency. Evolution over the past 3 million years has filtered out everything that wastes too much energy. The megalodon was a luxury creature of an abundant past. It was the 12-cylinder engine of an era that now runs on something far more tomatomical. It was simply too expensive to maintain today. The absence of the king is precisely why the princes reign today. The fact that great white sharks and orcas now occupy its former territories, that the throne has been vacant for millions of years. Were the megalodon still present? There's megalegal evidence that these smaller predators would never have been able to claim dominion. The departure of the megalodon is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is a chapter that has already been written, sealed by time and confirmed by science. But if it is not lurking in the deep, if it left no survivors, what actually happened to it? How does a creature so perfectly built, so widely distributed, so biologically formidable? The answer does not lie in a single catastrophic event. There was no asteroid falling from the sky. The end was something far more insidious, something we ourselves are living through today under very different circumstances. The demise of the Megalodon is a warning. It shows us that even the mightiest can fall when the world around them changes. The king did not lose his throne because he grew weak or was defeated in battle. He lost it because his castle was dismantled around him stone by stone, while he still lived inside it. When the word climate change is spoken today, we tend to think of warming, of melting glaciers and rising seas. But it is a pendulum, the deep history of our actions. Change is a pendulum that swings in both directions. For the Megalodon, the unchallenged ruler of the oceans, it swung in the most lethal direction of all. Into the cold. It was not the dramatic impact of an asteroid that extinguished it, as happened with the dinosaurs. There was no great crash, no fire in the sky to announce the end, by a world's slow and brutal process, a gradual suffocation by a world turning against it. To understand how the cooling of the Earth killed this giant, we must first dispense with a widespread ascension. For a long time, the dominant view in paleontology was simple. The Earth cooled, the oceans grew cold, and the Megalodon either froze or became too sluggish to function. Its sounditile becomes torpid in winter. A reptile becomes torpid in winter, and so people assume the same fate befell the giant shark. But as we have already learned, the data paints a completely different picture. The Megalodon was quite capable of inhabiting cooler latitudes. Its distribution did not correlate directly with temperature curves. It did not vanish simply because the thermometer dropped. It had its hidden. It could resist the cold. So why is climate change still the prime suspect in this extinction? If cold alone did not kill a don or freeze so, the answer is more insidious. The climate did not kill the Megalodon by freezing it. It killed it by restructuring the global infrastructure of the oceans. It did not take away the warmth. It took away the home and the food. As the Miocene drew to a close and the Pliocene gave way to the Pleistocene, a massive global cooling began. The polar ice caps, which had long been absent or much smaller, began to grow. Vast quantities of water were drawn out of the global cycle and locked away as ice on the continents of both hemispheres. Glaciers advanced across Scandinavia and North America. This process had a direct physical consequence for the oceans. Sea levels fell dramatically, and precisely here the first traps snapped shut. We must bear in mind where the Megalodon preferred to live and hunt. While it crossed the deep oceans, life and therefore food concentrated in the shallow continental shelves. These coastal zones, lit in the sunlight and rich in nutrients, were the engine of marine productivity. Even more importantly, these shallow waters served as nurseries. The Megalodon gave birth to its young in protected shallows, coastal areas that offered warm water and shelter from larger predators. As sea levels dropped due to the advancing ice, these habitats vanished, areas becoming land bridges, or denurseries, seas closed, safe havens closed. The safe havens evaporated. Quite literally, the consequences for reproduction were catastrophic. Without protected, shallow water, Megalodon young had nowhere to shelter. They were exposed to predation or starvation before reaching adulthood. A species that cannot raise its young has no future. At the same time, the cooling altered global ocean currents. The Isthmus of Panama began slowly to close, cutting off the warm equatorial current that had functioned for millions of years as the planet's central heating system. The Atlantic was separated from the Pacific. Oceans were divided more sharply into warm and cold zones. This new, sharper climatic division won them definite effects on the Megalodon's prey. Whales did not respond to the cold by dying. They responded by adapting. The frigid polar seas drove an explosion of plankton and krill. It was a feast at the ends of the earth. Whales began developing thick insulating blubber and shifting their migration routes into the extreme polar regions to capitalize on this new abundance. And here the Megalodon found itself caught in a trap of its own biology. Yes, it was mesothermic and could tolerate cooler water, but tolerance has limits. The feeding grounds of the modern whale lie in waters cold enough to strip heat from a shark far faster than any internal heating system can compensate. The energy cost of hunting in Antarctic or Arctic seas would have been ruinous. The Megalodon would have lost more calories fighting the cold than it could ever gain from eating a whale. It simply was not worth it. The whales had found a refuge. They could retreat to the ice, where the Megalodon could not follow them permanently. The king was locked in his warmer palace when in those warmer waters that remained available to him, food was growing scarce. Tropical oceans, without the vigorous mixing of colder currents, became increasingly barren. Nutrients sank away, productivity declined. The small baleen whales that formed the cornerstone of his diet were extinct or evolved into the wandering giants that were now beyond his reach. It was a pincers movement by the climate. On one side, falling sea levels closed the nurseries and took away his living space. On the other, his prey retreated into cold zones where he could not follow without catastrophic energy loss or disappeared entirely. And caught in the middle was a creature that weighed up to 94 tons and needed a ton of flesh every single day. The data confirms this scenario of ecological collapse. Extinction rates among large marine animals in the Pliocene were alarming. Overall, 36% of all large marine species vanished, including 55% of the large marine mammal species of marine turtles. The Megalodon was not the only victim. It was part of a mass extinction that emptied the oceans. Particularly poignant is the image of the final generations of these sharks. We should not picture it as though one morning all megalodons simply dropped dead. It was a process spanning thousands of years. Populations shrank. The animals perhaps grew somewhat smaller on average, a biological across many species, a biological response to chronic food scarcity. Territories were contested more fiercely. Stress within the population increased. Disease found easier purchase in weakened, hungry fading. One giant after another disappeared, and none replaced them. The Megalodon was perfection adapted to a world that ceased to exist. Its only failing was that it had staked everything on one strategy: great size, great hunger, great prey. When the Ice Age changed the rules, there was no going back. It could not suddenly begin filtering plankton, or living like a smaller reef shark. It was imprisoned in its own gigantic body. The very evolutionary force that had once favoured it became its executioner, and the cruel irony is that the climate change that killed the Megalodon was precisely what enabled the rise of the great whales we know today. The cold, nutrient-rich polar seas became the engine driving the growth of baleen whales. Without the Ice Age, without the extinction of their great predator, there would be no blue whales, no humpbacks, no fin whales in the abundance we know today. The death of one was the birth of the others. The disappearance of the Megalodon reveals an uncomfortable truth that resonates in our own time. Absolute dominance is no guarantee of survival when the underlying conditions change. It remains for us to ask whether we today are more resilient than the greatest hunter of all time, or whether we are committing the same error of over-specialization. The process that finally brought the Megalodon to its knees was not an abstract temperature problem. It was a very concrete temperature problem. To state it plainly, the supermarket closed as the Pliocene, the global abundance of a medium-sized whale species. The megalodons preferred to factor. This was the decisive factor. In the Middle Miocene, some 14 million years ago, the world was a paradise for predators of this kind. The oceans teemed with early baleen whale species, creatures around 4 to 10 meters long, slow-moving, poorly equipped with escape mechanisms and rich in fat. For the Megalodon, they were the perfect energy capsule, large enough to fill the stomach, but small enough to overpower without excessive risk. But as conditions deteriorated, research shows that the global abundance of the Megalodon correlated precisely with the decline of these specific prey animals. It was a domino effect, as environmental conditions harder depended on warm, shallow coastal en masse. What remained were the survivors of the crisis. And these survivors were entirely different of the past. Evolution in whales responded to the cold and to predation strategy, gigantian pressure, with an extreme strategy, gigantism. The whales that survived were the ancestors of our modern giants, blue whales, fin whales, humpbacks. By the Pleistocene, whales were on average twice the size of their Pliocene relatives. Size increase was a direct defense, presents an almost impossible challenge even for a megalodon. Too large, too powerful, and above all, too fast. Here the megalodon was caught in a lethal energetic bind. Its traditional prey, the small whales, was gone. The new prey, the enormous whales, was either in the polar seas where it would freeze, or so vast that any attack carried enormous risk. Attacking a fully grown blue whale is not simply hunting, it is attempting to stop a moving train. Even with a bite force of 180,000 newtons, the outcome is uncertain. A single strike from the flukes of a great whale could shatter the shark's jaw or spine. When the risk of injury rises, survival odds fall. A megalodon that cannot hunt loses its body heat. A megalodon that loses its heat dies. Why did it not simply eat something else? Seals? Fish? The answer lies again in the mercilessness of calories. The megalodon weighed up to 94 tons and was partially warm-blooded. Seals are agile and fast. To catch one, the giant shark must accelerate, turn, and burn energy. But a seal provides only a fraction of the energy a whale would. It would have needed to catch hundreds of seals to come close to its daily requirement. The energy spent hunting would have exceeded the energy gained from the catch. An economic total loss, this phenomenon in which a predator grows too large to hunt small prey efficiently, is well documented in biology. It sealed the megalodon's fate. It could not shrink. It could not reset its metabolism. It was a machine built for a world that no longer existed. The final millennia a melancholy spectacle. Fossil records suggest the animals were growing smaller toward the end, a sign of chronic deprivation. One can imagine these once proud rulers of the seas reduced to following the migration routes of great whales at a safe distance, hoping one might die of old age or illness. They became the vultures of the ocean, waiting for the death others brought rather than delivering it themselves. But scavenging alone cannot sustain a population of giants. And in this desperate competition for the last scraps, a new threat appeared. A threat that was smaller, but far more efficient, for while the megalodon starved, another predator was rising. One we know very well today. The great white shark. It is a cruel irony of evolution. The megalodon did not go out with a bang. It starved slowly, generation by generation. The great whales it had once terrorized took advantage of its absence to grow even larger. The opening of the ecological niche it left behind allowed the peaceful giants we admire today to become what they are. the explosion almost exactly in time with the extinction of the Megalodon. This is no coincidence. While the Megalodon was present, it was evolutionarily dangerous to be large and slow. Whales could grow enormous, accumulate vast stores of fat, and conquer the cold oceans unopposed. The blue whale is, in a certain sense, a living monument to the death of the Megalodon. Its very existence proves the monster is gone, but before the last Megalodon drew its final breath, it faced one additional humiliation. It was not hunger alone that defeated it. It was also the fact that something else was now doing its job better. Something that managed with less food, was more agile, and was better suited to the changing, cooling oceans. Carcharodon carcharias. A long time, scientist, the great white shark, for a long time was a direct descendant of the Megalodon, a shrunken grandchild of the giant. But as we have already established from the early 2000s, tooth analyses revealed this to be an error. The two are not closely related. They belong to completely different evolutionary families. The great white was not a successor. It was a competitor, a challenger that evolved from a separate lineage to contest the throne. On the surface, this competition seems absurd, reaches perhaps 6 to 7 meters, and weighs around 2 tons. A Megalodon was up to 24 meters and nearly 100 tons. In any direct confrontation, the Megalodon would likely have swallowed the great white in a single pass. It would not have been a dismissal. It would not have been a fight. But wars in nature are rarely decided by individual gladiatorial combat. They are won through logistics, and a great white shark held an overwhelming advantage. Think of the Megalodon as a 12-cylinder engine from another era. Magnificent, powerful, a pure force of destruction, but burning through fuel at an unsustainable rate. The great white was the efficient, less raw power, but travelling far further on a full tank. In a world where fuel, the whales, suddenly became scarce and expensive, the economical model held the decisive edge. As the oceans cooled and large whales migrated toward the poles, the warmer waters left behind held little food. For the Megalodon, this was a catastrophe. It had to consume enormous quantities just to keep its massive body warm. If it found nothing for a day, it was already running a deficit. The great white, which also possesses a form of regional warm-bloodedness, but has a far smaller body less. A seal, a large tuna, so a small dolphin, could keep a great white satisfied for weeks. For the Megalodon, an animal of that size would not even have registered as a snack, and the energy spent in catching something so quick would have exceeded the gain. This competition was not limited to feeding. It extended to reproduction. The same shallow coastal nurseries where the Megalodon raised its young were also the territory of the emerging great whites. A newborn Megalodon was roughly 4 meters long, already substantial, but a fully grown great white is larger and more experienced. It is highly probable that great white sharks actively hunted the juveniles of their enormous competitor, eliminating the next generation of giants before those giants could ever become dangerous. A war fought at the cradle, and then alongside the great white, another predator emerged that raised the concept of efficiency to an entirely new dimension, the ancestors of today's orcas. Killer whales bring social intelligence to the equation. They hunt in coordinated groups, divide labour, communicate, and develop complex strategies. A coordinated pod of intelligent orcas is a power that even a Megalodon would have struggled to counter. We observe today how orcas hunt great white sharks systematically, targeting their livers with surgical precision. It requires no great leap to imagine similar scenes playing out 3 million years ago. An old, weakened, or starving Megalodon, set upon by a group of organised, relentless hunters from every angle, New competition brought the Megalodon to its knees, and highly efficient consummation to Kundry. It was attacked on two fronts simultaneously, from belate white sharks by great white sharks and other predators reaching prey before the giant could. From above, climatic change pressed relentlessly downward. The Megalodon was too large, too specialized, too expensive to operate. Its very size, once its greatest strength, had become its greatest vulnerability. In biology, it'd call this an entirely to one niche. Hunting great toe had lost all flexibales, and in doing so had lost all flexibility. The great white shark was the generalist, the Swiss army knife of the oceans, while the Megalodon was as a single-purpose instrument. In a world demanding fine precision, the enormous tool had become useless. The great white shark and the orca are the reason we see no megalodons today. The ecological niche of the apex ocean predator is occupied. Were the Megalodon to return, it would find no room. The oceans are divided among its more efficient successors, and as the last of these sharks faded, the ocean breathed. Not only the whale populations, but the great white sharks and orcas themselves expanded. It was as though finally reached the water, and sunlight, a great shadow had lifted. The end of the tyrant was the beginning of a new order. We tend to regard the great white shark as the ultimate ocean predator. But in truth, it is the survivor, the winner not of any single battle. It endured because it was humble enough not to grow beyond what nature could sustain. The great white today rarely exceeds 7 meters, because anything larger would be inefficient. It has learned, in the language of evolution, from the mistakes of the Megalodon. The contest was ultimately not decided by teeth alone. It was decided by the better strategy. The Megalodon played by the rules of the warm, abundant Miocene. The great white played by the rules of the cold, lean Pliocene. And those who cannot adapt when the rules change mid-game are disqualified. So the greatest hunter of all time disappeared not with a roar, but with a quiet growl of hunger, outmaneuvered by smaller, cleverer opponents. It is the end of a dynasty and the beginning of the modern ocean as we know it. Which raises an inevitable question. Is intelligence and efficiency, in the end, always more powerful than raw strength? The oceans appear to have given their answer. We now stand at the end of our journey through nearly 20 million years of Earth's history. We have witnessed the birth of a giant, its unstoppable rise to rule the world's oceans, and its slow, agonizing descent into the darkness of extinction. What remains of a creature that once transformed every ocean on Earth into a landscape of fear? On the surface, the Megalodon's legacy appears sparse. A handful of fossil fragments gathering dust splayed in Museum KZ Fontaine Saint-Los. No complete skeleton. No frozen body preserved in ice. Compared to the dinosaurs, from which we often recover entire skeletons, the Megalodon is a ghost. It exists almost entirely in reconstruction, assembled from mathematical formulas, comparative anatomy, and fragments. And yet, if we look more deeply, we find that its legacy is immense, not carved in stone, but written into life itself. The Megalodon shaped the modern ocean, the greatest monument, but through its absence swims through our seas, today, very much alive. The blue whale. The gentle giants of the present, the great baleen whales, could only grow to their true grandeur once the pressure of the ultimate predator was lifted. So long as the Megalodon patrolled these waters, being large and slow was a death sentence. Once the tyrant was gone, the whales could breathe, and they assumed those majestic forms we find so moving today. The next time you watch a documentary about whales, or if you are ever fortunate enough to witness one in the open sea, remember, you are seeing the consequence of a world of the Megalodon. Their size is the shadow cast by its extinction. The story of the Megalodon also a lesson in scientific humility. For centuries, we held it to be an oversized great white shark. We projected our modern fears onto a creature of deep time, reducing it to a blunt monster of superlatives, with the place now more fascinating. Something far more fascinating with something far more fascinating. We now know it was more slender, more elegant, perhaps slower but more lethal in the final sprint. Not a stocky armoured vehicle, but a hydrodynamic masterpiece. We know it was partially warm-blooded, a biological furnace that could hunt all consumed by its own voracious energy demands. The Spridian. These discoveries make it no less frightening. On the contrary, subject to physical laws, are capable of growing cold and hungry, is far more unsettling than an invulnerable film monster. It shows us that even absolute evolutionary perfection can fail when the world shifts. The Megalodon was not too weak or too slow-witted. It was too perfectly adapted to a world that ceased to exist. That is a warning that carries meaning for us as well. Specialization is power, adaptability is survival. Why does this animal continue to captivate us so deeply? There seems to be a profound longing in our nature for a world not yet fully explained. We want to believe that there are secrets out there still larger than ourselves. In an age when every centimetre of the land has been mapped and catalogued, the ocean remains the last territory of our imagination. The Megalodon is the placeholder for that ancient fear and that ancient fascination. We long for the monster even as we should be grateful it is gone. Consider the alternative clearly for a moment. Were it still here, a summer beach holiday would be a life-threatening venture. Our shipping lanes would be contested by a predator larger than the vessels using them. The history of human seafaring would have unfolded entirely differently. Perhaps we would never have dared to venture beyond sight of shore. The death of the Megalodon was also, in a quiet sense, a precondition for human mastery of the oceans. Yet, despite all the science, despite final mystery endures, one final mystery endures, and this is perhaps the most human part of the whole story. We still have no body. So long as no complete skeleton has been found, there will always remain a small residue of speculation. What did its dorsal fin truly look like? Did it carry scars from battles with giant squid or with Livyatan? These questions may never be fully answered. The chance that an animal built of cartilage would be preserved whole across millionshinly small. We must accept that we will never see this creature face to face. Face, neither living nor petrified. We must assemble it in our minds, piece by piece, tooth by tooth. There is something almost elegiac about that, should perhaps leave a greater mark. And so vast and powerful, it should go out in one final epic confrontation. Reality is often quieter, it vanished, but that it is tidus muntlaser than fiction. But that is precisely what makes it so profound. For millions of years it was the king that. But let us not end in sorrow. The Megalodon was the ultimate predator. The Megalodon was the ultimate predator. It was the pinnacle of shark evolution. In the time since its disappearance, nature has never again attempted to build a super predator of this kind. Perhaps because it learned that there is a limit, with a threshold beyond which size becomes burden, the Megalodon is gone. Yes, definitively Mariana extinct. It does not lurk in the Mariana Trench, and it is not waiting in some other forgotten corner of the deep. But so long as we speak of it, so long as we from the sand and tell its story, it endures. It endures as a warning, as a wonder, and as the eternal king of the deep. The world beneath the surface of the sea is a world of giants to be told. And there are so many more waiting told, and there are so many more waiting still ghost.